Can you hear me? Great. Hello. Hi. Welcome. My name is Angie Brenner. I'm the city librarian for Mill Valley, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to a very crowded First Friday. First, let me start by introducing Stephanie Moulton Peters, the mayor for the city of Mill Valley. We're very pleased to have the mayor support library events. Thank you. Stephanie again. And thank you to the Friends and the Foundation for making these programs possible. Yes. Tonight's program was actually suggested to us by a longtime friend of the library, Linda Chittenden. Applause for everyone. And she not only made the connection for us to tonight's speaker, but she asked if she could do the introduction. So who am I to stand in the way of that kind of request? So I'll turn it over to Linda. After Thomas does his lecture tonight, there'll be a Q&A, and then he can sign books in the lobby. Okay, thank you. Linda?
I'm Linda, and I'm on the board of the Friends of the Mill Valley Public Library, an organization that all of you should belong to. I have known Thomas Getz for over 25 years, since he was a student at Bates College and a boyfriend of a much-loved former Old Mill student of mine, Whitney Wright, who is now the mother of his children. I have watched over all these years Tom's fascinating professional journey, eventually threading together two intellectual domains, the world of letters and journalism, as well as science and medicine. At these extended family gatherings, a literature major, Thomas would always ask me, "What are you reading?" And after Bates, he went to University of Virginia and got a master's degree in literature. But he eschewed academia, and he and Whit moved to New York City, where he started first as a stringer at the Village Voice. Then he worked on the staff of the Wall Street Journal. Then he moved to San Francisco and worked at Wired magazine, where he spent 12 years as executive editor. But Thomas Getz grew up in a medical family. His father was a physician. His mother is a nurse. One sister worked in public health, and another sister is a surgeon. He puts a high value on work that benefits society. While working full-time at Wired, he wrote the book, The Decision Tree, a guide for taking control of your health in the new era of personalized medicines. It's so new to me, I have to look down here to say it. And during those years at Wired, he also got a master's degree in public health at UC Berkeley. A couple of years ago, Tom left Wired, choosing to become more of a science journalist as well as a healthcare innovator. And now he is an entrepreneur in residence at the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation. He's also the co-founder of the health technology company Iodine. Now, perhaps on another First Friday, Tom will entertain and inform us about Iodine, an internet site that uses big data to help people make better decisions about their healthcare choices, what drugs to take, what options you have, and so on. But tonight, you're going to be entertained and informed about the early days of medicine, and hear a story about Robert Koch, a provincial German doctor turned revolutionary scientist whose kitchen sink discoveries inspired a new age of medicine and ultimately aroused the interest and then suspicion of another ambitious doctor, Arthur Conan Doyle. You will learn about them and the quest to cure tuberculosis. In The Remedy, Thomas Getz has brilliantly interwoven scientific and literary history into a tale showing that without Robert Koch, Sherlock Holmes would never have existed. And I'm supposed to turn this off.
Thank you, Linda. That was nice. Thank you. So my family isn't here, which is embarrassing to me. They're up in Idaho, but I have to tell you the first story of when I came to Mill Valley. I can almost pass as a Mill Valley native, not among Mill Valley natives like this. You guys would get me out like that. But in the hinterlands I could, because I first came here when I was 18, and the story I was telling was when I first arrived, so I'm from Minneapolis, or Minnesota, right, the great north country, someplace over there. And going in and out? Okay. I don't know what to do. Speaking things, it's on. I'll bend it. You guys you're all IT people. Who knew? All right, so what was happening was I arrive in Mill Valley. Whitney picks me up. We go to her house, which is up on Eldridge, and we sit down on the. We eat right next to the hot tub. First, kind of disconnect there, and Whitney's mom, Sue, right, serves a lunch of Trader Joe's green tomatillo salsa, which this is 1989. Never seen such a thing. And artichokes. There were 3 artichokes. And that was crazy to me because in Minnesota, I grew up as a family of 6 with 1 artichoke. We would cut the heart 6 ways. So this was amazing to me. So when it's been in my heart ever since. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So I want to talk to you today, in some sense, about some of the ideas that are in the book, but in some sense, the stuff that my editor cut out, the stuff that she wouldn't let me, probably rightly, write so much about. And it was some of these ideas that basically drew me as somebody who cares about technology and innovation professionally to some of the threads and elements that I put into the book. So this is, Linda, thank you for advancing my first slide. It's all right. This is a sense of what life was like in the middle of the 19th century. This is a painting called Consumption. I'm blanking on who painted it. One of you scholars should know. All right, it'll get better than this. The phenomenon of consumption, of tuberculosis in the 19th century was one of profound and constant, almost monotonous horror, if you could imagine. It was a ubiquitous disease. Fully a quarter of Americans, a quarter of Europeans died of tuberculosis. And if you do the math, given the nature of the disease, that means that about half of the population suffered from the disease at some point, and fully, almost pretty much the entire population would have been exposed to the bacteria. So everybody was a carrier of the disease, and given the peculiar natures of tuberculosis, half of them would actually manifest the disease, and then a quarter of those or half of those again, would actually end up dying of it. The odd thing about the disease was, unlike other infectious diseases, it was a disease that could take years or decades or many decades to actually manifest to the point of fatality or mortality. So it was a disease that was very poorly understood in terms of its cause. In fact, what we now understand to be tuberculosis, they understood at the time to be many different diseases. Consumption, scrofula, lupus. It was all these different manifestations of the same bacteria. So that's what the disease was, and I just want to start there because it's important to understand how pervasive and profound and common the experience of people dying of this disease was. In fact, the overall mortality rate at the time was about 5 times the mortality rate today, which is to say 5 times as many people died every year as die today, which is to say that it was just a more common experience. People were more used to death, and they were more used to having no agency or nothing to do about it. It just happened. It was part of routine life in a sense that it just isn't today at all. And there was, of course, no cure for these diseases. There was almost nothing that medicine could do. On into the 1870s, 1880s, medicine offered nothing. There was surgery, but largely medicine was at best palliative. This was still the great age of bleeding. It was an age where people tried desperately anything they could, but there was no salvation or no hope in medicine. Now, that it wasn't to say there weren't cures. There were lots of cures. There were people who could cure it with white wine of tar syrup. They could cure it with cod liver oil. This was, of course, the dawn of cod liver oil. We think of it today, but this is why it came into prominence was because of tuberculosis. They could cure it with cannabis. They could cure it with Duffy's Pure Malt Whiskey. Now, of course, none of these things worked, but it speaks of how profoundly universal the disease was, but also how desperate people were for something. They would try anything. Today, we understand tuberculosis to be caused by this. This is the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It is a very difficult disease to spot. It's actually, or as a bacteria, it's not something that you can just kind of take the blood, put it under a microscope. It's even hard to see for reasons if I have time, I'll get into. But just seeing it, in some sense, isn't enough. In fact, this man, Jean-Antoine Villemin, was the first, in some sense, to see it under a microscope. He saw it and published an essay in mid-1860s on tuberculosis, and he identified what he thought was a proof that tuberculosis was caused by that bacteria. And the world did nothing. Nobody believed. Nobody believed that Villemin had sufficiently proved his case. And one of the problems was that at that point, in the 1860s, there was such a thing as a scientific method. There was broadly a kind of Descartesian method, but there wasn't a strict protocol. There wasn't a kind of discipline, a method of laboratory science that would allow somebody like Villemin to execute an experiment and then convince the world that his discovery was true. So, take this off. It was an age where lots of different scientists had ideas for what constituted a necessary burden of causality, proving that an agent caused disease. But Villemin, in some sense, despite his efforts, wasn't there. He didn't have enough. So he published his findings, but the world didn't do anything. And then came Robert Koch. And in some sense, Villemin disappeared because Koch had that burden of evidence. What Koch had was this method. He was, in many sense, the classic, diligent, rigorous German. He was all about his method. He grew up in a mining town, one of many boys. He had an obscure life. He was a country doctor. He practiced at the front of the Franco-Prussian War, which actually solidified his German nationalism, his patriotism. But what Koch had was ambition. He wanted to be more than a country doctor. And so when his wife offered to buy him, having saved enough money to buy him a present, she offered to buy him a microscope or a carriage to make visiting his patients easier. He chose the microscope. He wanted to use his spare time to investigate, to actually try to come up with a process where he could learn things using that tool. And so he did. So he put himself to task, and his first great discovery was the bacteria that caused anthrax. He lived in a town called Wolstein in eastern Germany, what is now Poland. Wolstein means woolstone. It was, you could say, a town of wool, wool being one of the greatest industries of Germany at the time. So it mattered, and anthrax was a ubiquitous disease for agriculture. It was a problem with agriculture. And so Koch was one day a local police official brought a carcass of a beast that had died, and it was a sheep, and presented it to Koch because he was the local doctor. He was the local authority for medicine. Koch had no idea what may have been the cause. But what he did was he started to use his microscope and create a process. So he extracted the blood from the sheep, and he looked and identified those bacteria. He identified animals, or animalcules, as they called them then. But that wasn't enough. He had seen something. This being, I'm sorry, not those things. It was anthrax, so it was not the tuberculosis bacteria. But he saw them under his microscope, but he knew that wasn't enough. Villemin had done that, right? Villemin had looked under his microscope using a sample and seen in the blood an animal, some little thing that seemed like it was alive. But what he had to do was prove that this was the agent of disease. And this was important because if you think about it, just because you saw something in the blood doesn't mean that that was the cause of disease. The problem was that that could have been the result of the disease as much as the cause of it. And why should anybody believe that those little things cause disease? There was no conception that such a thing as germs could cause disease. There was no such a conception of things such as germs. If you couldn't see it, humans didn't believe it could exist. So, what did Koch do? He took the blood, he took the animals in the blood, and he cultured them. He went to a local slaughterhouse, got a cow's eye. This is a little graphic, but it's fun. He sliced it open, got the liquid from the cow's eye, and put a drop of the blood in that liquid. So it was sterile, but organic liquid. And lo and behold, those little animals grew. They reproduced. And so he took that substance and put it into a mouse that he had gotten from the barn in the back. And lo and behold, that mouse then died of anthrax. And so he took the blood out and extracted it and cultured it and repeated this again and again and again and again, 20, 30 times, until he had finally created a chain of causation that he believed was convincing. Now, the thing was, he was completely alone. He was in isolation. And again, there was no real method for this. So the fact that he was locked alone, in some sense, made him uniquely suited to coming up with a protocol, because he had no kind of great to-do to make of it. There was no way, no expectation on his part that people were going to come flocking to him. He just was doing his experiment. But he finally sent away his conclusions to a local university, and lo and behold, they realized that they had a local genius on their hands. They had somebody who had created a process that, in fact, had proven what was unprovable before. He had proven that germs, these bacteria, caused a disease, that disease being anthrax. And so that was the birth of Koch's career. In time, he was kind of promoted up to Berlin, given a lab. And in many ways, this process improves the adage from Francis Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, that in science the credit goes to the man who convinces the world, not to the man whom the first idea first occurs. Right? So, but that matters. It doesn't matter just to be first. It's not enough to be first. If you don't have enough evidence, if you can't convince other people to follow your direction to a new course into the future, in some sense, you don't deserve credit for the discovery. So that's kind of the nugget of discovery, right? And that's what Koch's first kind of great breakthrough was creating the rigor, creating the process for what we now understand to be in vitro science, science in a dish. So what happened then? So Koch had his discovery, and we, in some sense, presume that, okay, now he's had the discovery, it's going to change the world, right? He discovered that germs exist, he proved that germs exist, the world is going to follow him. It's going to look like that, right? But that's not the case. One of the things that I learned, and I worked out, and we worked out when I was at Wired for a dozen years, was that, in fact, there's this whole much more intricate process between invention or discovery and true innovation, innovation that changes society. innovation that makes it all the way to society. It's not just enough to discover something under your microscope. It's not even enough to prove something to other scientists, to your colleagues. You need to go through a lot more trouble. And the world needs to be convinced in a lot more, it takes a lot more work, basically. You have to go through a scale of creating in some sense, a technology, a tool. That discovery has to, in some sense, have some utility. That could be a utility in your discipline, but in some sense, it has to be instrumented. And then that needs to have some utility in an industry, right? It needs to actually make some impact where it, in some sense, has a business impact, a commercial impact. That's when that discovery is starting to have true impact. But ultimately, that industrial capacity needs to, in some sense, affect society. Only when it touches people in the fabric of their daily lives does that constitute what I would call true innovation. And that's a harder process. There are a lot more hoops to go through in that arc of innovation. So, Koch had his method. What did he do with it? A few years later, in 1881, he set his sights on another bacteria, so to speak. It was that tuberculosis bacteria. Now, this was his discovery. This was the publication. It's important to note that these are hand-drawn, right? So there was no photography at the time that could basically demonstrate the conclusion that the scientist had. In some sense, if you wanted to read the science, you had to trust the scientist. You had to trust the hand of the scientist that what they were drawing was, in fact, what they saw. There was this whole kind of proxy understanding of proof, right? So it made it that much more difficult for that discovery to be validated. That was one of the Koch's great innovations. When he discovered, between the time when he discovered the anthrax bacteria and the tuberculosis bacteria, he worked with the Carl Zeiss company, now we know as a camera or lens company. He worked with them to develop a form of microphotography whereby he could actually photograph microbes. So he could get one step closer to making it easier for people to believe. He created a new kind of technology, in essence, that made his proof a little easier, a little more tangible to the world at large. It was a very important step, and it's actually the step that I think I've run into here and there occasionally with scientists that I've run into. Scientists who have a knack not just for the laboratory science, but actually a knack for understanding that next step, understanding how they need to, in some sense, instrumentize or technologize their innovations. It's a rare talent. It's one that I think is exceptional, and we should laud it when it happens, because when people have that capacity, they're moving science a little bit faster. It's innovation in practice. So in some sense, this is what Koch was able to do, right? He was able to take his innovations and turn them into a discovery, or turn his discovery and turn it into a technology. So I want to pause here for a second on the 19th century. Some of you are probably getting sleepy with the 19th century, so I want to take you to someplace really exciting. Are you ready? Yeah. Here we go. 1950s Iowa. All right? Are you with me? Actually, late 1940s. But here's what was happening. So we're totally switched, right? This is like one of those cuts in a movie. You got to remember what I told you, but we're in a new scene. It's like Crash or something. Totally different characters. Okay, 1940s, late post-war Iowa. There was a experiment going on in the fields of Iowa. It was an experiment with a herbicide called 2,4-D that had been developed actually in England during the war as a way to grow crops faster. They wanted to create a way to make plants grow faster so they would have more food. So they created a way to basically isolated a plant hormone that would trigger faster growth in the plants. And it worked. It worked so well that the plants would, in essence, grow themselves to death. They would burst. And it turned out that somebody had the smart idea at the University of Iowa, at a leading agricultural college. That might be a phenomenon that could be turned into an advantage. If we could put that on weeds, right? If we could get weeds to, in some sense, overgrow themselves and die, that might be something worth industrializing. So it was an experiment, it was a discovery, right? And the trick was, the challenge was, the thing that the University of Iowa was trying to identify was, is this something we can technologize? Is this something we can turn into an actual technology? So the story goes like this. There was a scientist working on it, and he had a farmer friend. Let's call him Farmer A. This is in Story County, Iowa. And so Farmer A started to use this herbicide, this chemical. And it worked. It killed the weeds, and he had a bigger yield. He grew more corn. I believe it was corn that year. Yeah, it was corn. And so then his neighbor, Farmer B, observed Farmer A's success, and he decided to ask what his secret was. And he got some hold of the herbicide, and he started to use it, and Farmer B had success. And a couple years later, Farmer C, the other neighbor, went onto it. And over the course of about 8 years, all the farmers, all the way to Farmer I in Story County, had started to use this herbicide. And this is a classic kind of pattern of innovation. In fact, the terminology that the scientific historian, the scientific sociologist, Everett Rogers, who was observing this as a grad student, what he called it the diffusion of innovation, actually looking at the pattern of how innovation spreads. And that first farmer, Farmer A, he is known as an early adopter. So when you use the phrase early adopter, you're taking a phrase born of Iowa farmers, not Silicon Valley. So that pattern was this magical pattern, right? It was a way of kind of watching how discovery could actually be turned into, in this sense, all the way to an industrial change, right? So that's as far as I've taken the story with the agriculture. As far as industry, that's the kind of the hoops that it's gone through. This is what we would hope it would look like in terms of social impact, right? I should have stopped at Whole Foods, one of the many Whole Foods in Mill Valley, and taken a snapshot there and subbed it in. This is some other shop. But this is what we expect, right? It's the bounty of delicious produce. It's kind of, you all go to Whole Foods. You know what I'm talking about. It looks so good. That's what we expect that this particular discovery manifested in, right? Unfortunately, it also resulted in this, right? What happened was that this was the Green Revolution. This was the revolution that made food incredibly cheap and incredibly easy and basically dependable. It made agriculture an industrial process. And in so doing, it changed the way we think about food. So let me show you what the impact is. So this is a list of basic produce, basic food that you might get in any supermarket. These are the prices in 1950. These are the prices today based on my, I went and looked at Safeway yesterday. So these are basically, so you see they all went up in price, right? But if you adjust them for inflation, they've all gone down in price. That's what happened with the Green Revolution, right? That is in essence what happened. That one discovery, and the dozens more like it, right? I mean, it wasn't just 2,4-D. It was this profusion of changes that happened with industrialized agriculture. But that's what happened. That was what the social impact was, right? It made food incredibly cheap, which is wonderful, but it also has some downsides, as we know, right? The obesity rates that we're dealing with in this country, that in some sense is symptomatic of this change. So all these social changes aren't necessarily positive, but that's what innovation is like, right? That's the kind of tidal wave that's unleashed when you start to move through those hoops. So, okay, another example. So we're leaving Iowa. Say goodbye to Iowa. Any questions? No, I won't. I'll keep going. So this is, does anybody know what this is? No. Jeff O'Brien, do you know what this is? Yeah, that's an excuse. He used to work with me throughout it. He should know. That is ENIAC, the first computer. Did somebody know that? Somebody knew that. Okay, good, thank you. You're wiser than me. I had to look this up. So this, what I want to talk about here is how do we go from this in 1940, which is actually not entirely coincidentally, it's another story, but not coincidentally the same time as what was happening in Iowa, to this, right? That change, those two slides speak of a profound innovation change, sociological change, all those hoops happened. I think the best way to describe this change is in some sense these two quotes. Now this is actually this quote is too good to be true, and in fact it is too good to be true. He probably didn't say it. He said something like this, but this is the one that gets repeated. So don't repeat it. This is the last time anybody should ever put this on a slide. But so this is in some sense, people use this quote because it speaks of kind of the naivete of people at that age, even people at IBM. But I actually think that the important thing about this quote is that, in some sense, Watson was part of those first two hoops, right? He was part of kind of the IBM was born in 1943. This was exactly when the computer was being developed both as a scientific and as a technology, scientific discovery and a technology. It was being created as a tool and an instrument. It was one of these moments where the science and the technology were completely interrelated. His mistake was actually not to see how the profound social change. He was actually going to the next ring, right? He was going to the industrial change. He saw a world market. He saw that there would be a market. He just thought it was going to be 5 computers, or something like that. Whoever said that. This is a more accurate quote. And importantly, this was a generation later, right? This is 1977. This is DEC's Digital Equipment Corporation, which was one of the leading computer companies of the time, of the 70s. Again, what Ken Olsen, he could see right in front of him, he could see the industrial change. His business was to sell computers to business. He couldn't see the next phase. He didn't see the horizon, the true potential of that discovery. He didn't see the true potential for that innovation. All right, so this is the arc. Are we set on the arc, the kind of pattern I'm trying to throw around? Let's go back to Coke. So we're done with that scene, cut, go back to 1882. Here is Coke at the height of his fame. You can't see it, but the snake there is the tuberculosis bacillus. The horse is investigation, which is his method, right? I mean, it's a great metaphor. This ran in a British newspaper. So the horse is investigation, and in his hand, his lance is, it says microscope. So these are the tools, right? That is his process, and that is his technology. That is what he is deploying against disease. But of course, when we left him here, right? Just at the point of having a technology. Germs still were, in some sense, an academic insight. It wasn't something that had yet an industrial impact. In fact, it was still, even after Koch had made these first couple of discoveries, it was still almost heresy. It was certainly a radical notion to believe in germs. At this time, there was one of my favorite phrases of the time was that germs were considered imps of scientific imagination. This was a leading suffragette of the time who, in this weird kind of, I can't get into it, but it's this amazing tangle between suffragism, anti-vaccination, and anti-vivisection. It was all wrapped up in one cause. Very confusing given today's political dynamics. But she regarded, and many people regarded, the advance of science as an affront to personal autonomy because they were trying to maybe impinge on the way people lived their lives. And so they rejected it entirely as a fantasy. They wouldn't believe it. So which is to say that it had not yet been industrialized and certainly did not yet have any societal impact. Until it started to. And the first one was Joseph Lister. So we know Lister today by, do I have to say it? Yes, thank you. Listerine. He had nothing to do with Listerine. Can you hear me? Is this working? Am I speaking loud enough anyway? Kind of? So Joseph Lister had nothing to do, but he was actually a professor of medicine in Scotland and London, and he decided to take some of the innovations that were being discovered by Koch and by this man, Louis Pasteur, and to put them into practice. And so Lister started to actually, in some sense, industrialize the germ theory by changing surgery. So he was able to prove that by using carbolic acid and other disinfectant techniques, very, very what we would consider coarse and almost barbaric methods of disinfection, he was able to prove by surgical outcomes that that there was some benefit to obeying what would be considered the germ theory. So Lister started to industrialize the germ theory. He started to turn it into something that, in fact, could change people's lives, because before the germ theory, people would die after surgery in profound amounts. Can I tell you a gross story? All right. So, this is a great one. Semmelweis was one of the, this is kind of a tangent, so parentheses. So Semmelweis was a professor in medicine in Vienna, and he observed, this was 1850s, so years before Pasteur or Koch, but he was one of these early kind of radicals who believed in the germ theory. And he believed in it because of this story. Semmelweis, in his hospital in Vienna, there were two wards, two maternity wards. There was one for wealthy women and one for poor women. And oddly, the wealthy women were dying at much greater rates than the poor women. And he couldn't figure out why, so he started to look at it. And the poor women were administered by midwives. The wealthy women were administered by doctors and medical students. So he started to look at the behaviors of these doctors and medical students and the midwives. And it turned out that in the wealthy ward, the doctors and the medical students would go directly from the autopsy room to the maternity ward and perform births without washing their hands. Because why should they wash their hands? Because there was no such thing as germs. So Semmelweis made this discovery. He ran, it was actually a well-done study. If you look at the statistics, we would consider it a sufficient burden of proof of statistical evidence even today. But the world didn't want to believe. And though Semmelweis was able to change practice in his hospital for a few years, eventually he was ignored, and he ended up going insane and died in an insane asylum in Vienna because no one would believe him. And just think about how profound that is. You had proven that germs were killing people. You tried to tell the world wouldn't believe you, and you went insane. All of us would be insane. All right, close parentheses. So back to Pasteur, because Pasteur was important because at the time when he was doing his great science in the 1880s, Pasteur was likewise doing great science along the germ theory in Paris at the same time. And again, remember I mentioned the Franco-Prussian War, where Koch was on the German side. Pasteur's son, he was older than Koch, but Pasteur's son was fighting on the French side. And Pasteur was as much a French patriot as Koch was a German patriot. In fact, during the war, Pasteur sent back an honorary degree that he had received from Bonn University. Right after the war, Pasteur, who started to work in his germ theory for industrial reasons. He was actually assigned the germ theory by brewers and vintners who found that their crop or their beer and their wine was going bad for unknown reasons. And Pasteur was able to discover such a thing as yeast. After he did that discovery, created what he called the beer of revenge. So it was a beer that he believed would be as good as German beer, but it was just for French people. So that was Pasteur's work, and he had a great lab, the Pasteur Institute, which still exists today in Paris, and there was this amazing decade of discovery between the two rivals. Koch had his lab in Berlin, and they had this one discovery after another. So Koch discovered anthrax. Pasteur created a vaccine for anthrax, one up in Koch. Koch discovered in his lab, he discovered streptococcus and staph. Pasteur was able to discover diphtheria. And it went back and forth, and they had this actually great race where there was an outbreak of cholera in Egypt, and Koch took a team and raced to Egypt, and Pasteur sent his own team. He didn't go himself, but he sent a team to Egypt to make this discovery because they thought that cholera was probably infectious, but they didn't know what the agent was. And the French got their first Koch arrived a few days after, but unfortunately the leader of the French team came down with cholera and died, and Koch was a pallbearer at his funeral. By that point, the epidemic had waned in Egypt, but it had taken up in India, where of course cholera originates, and so Koch raced to India, got permission from the German government, went to India, spent many months, about 9 months, actually doing the research and trying to identify the cause until finally he felt that he had identified definitively that the cholera was caused by a bacteria, made this announcement, had it published, and was given not only a hero's welcome when he came back to Germany, but was given almost a war hero's welcome. He was given a military medal, which again just points up the stakes of these as a national rivalry. So, you can imagine how Koch must have felt when in 1885, Pasteur announced that he had created a vaccine for rabies. Now, years before, as I said, Pasteur had created a vaccine for anthrax, but that was largely just used in animals, right, in agriculture. It did not have any tangible human effect, right? It affected people's lives in the course of their careers, but it didn't mean life or death for individuals. But Pasteur, by actually coming up with a vaccine for rabies, which is actually caused by a virus, not a bacteria, so he wasn't able to identify the cause, but he was able to identify a treatment in the sense that it can be administered after a bite happens, right? So it doesn't make rabies go away, but if you're bitten by a rabid animal, it will prevent the disease from manifesting. And Pasteur had come up with that. He did a rather vulgar, what we would consider a completely unethical experiment on a child which he witnessed, which nobody seemed to care about at the time because they had not yet invented the protocol for human experiments. But anyway, Pasteur had gotten, in some sense, the better of Koch because he had gotten that one step further, one step closer to people's everyday lives, right? He had actually created something that could turn death, in some sense, into life. He could save people's lives. And this, again, being an agricultural time, rabies was not an uncommon disease. It was something that happened all over the place. So Koch was jealous. That's the simplest way to put it. And a few years later, lo and behold, he came up with this. He announced that he had created a cure, or what he called a Heilmittel, a remedy for tuberculosis, which again was the leading cause of death in Europe, leading cause of death in America. And just as Koch's experiments happened, so did, just as Pasteur's experiments happened, so did Koch's. So tuberculosis being the most deadly, the most pervasive disease on the face of the earth, having identified it as being caused by a bacteria 8 years before, when in 1890, Koch announced that he had the cure, a remedy, not a vaccine, mind you, a remedy, the world went crazy. Since he lived in Berlin, the trains to Berlin filled up with consumptives. They took over the hospitals, they flooded hotels, they took over coffee shops. The local police did not know what to do with them. They were dying all over the place, waiting, hoping, desperate for a dose of Koch's remedy. Koch actually didn't tell anybody what his remedy was, which even in those early days of science, was still kind of smelled funny. It still broke rules, but it didn't matter. In some sense, he was given a pass because he was Robert Koch. He was one of the great geniuses of science. If anybody could bring us a remedy, people believed, it would be Koch. And so they gave him an allowance in keeping the actual agent of his cure, what he called tuberculin, which was in fact just denatured or dead TB bacteria mixed with glycerin. So what happened was that people would get injected with this and it would cause an immune reaction, right? Since, as I said earlier, everybody had been exposed to the bacteria pretty much. What this meant was that everybody had an immune reaction because they had, in some sense, been exposed to the bacteria. That reaction was quite profound. There was vomiting, there was diarrhea, there was an incredibly high fever. It was a quite violent and profound response. So it seemed like something was happening, and Koch took that response to be curative. So what happened next? So in November of that year, Koch announced a demonstration of his remedy. The world wanted to know what it was. They wanted to see what it was. And so he would create a demonstration. So the scientists this was only 2 months after the remedy had first been announced. So the scientists of Europe flocked to Berlin. Among them was this man, Arthur Conan Doyle. He was a country doctor, in some sense much like Koch, a country doctor who wanted some greater glory in his life. He wanted a piece of something. And he had dabbled in writing, he had tried. He'd even written a couple of these long novels featuring a kind of curious detective. But nobody really read them. He certainly didn't have enough success to quit medicine. But when he read about Koch's cure and his remedy, it sparked something in him. And so he joined the throng to Berlin. And they wouldn't let him in. They wouldn't let him into the auditorium. He went to Koch's house. He couldn't get a ticket, so he went to Koch's house. He was invited by the butler to Koch's foyer. The butler went upstairs and he said, I'll go see if the great Koch will see you. Arthur Conan Doyle is waiting down there. A postman comes with a huge sack of mail, dumps it in the foyer. Hundreds of letters spill out, all desperate, from people desperate for a cure, a piece of the cure, a dose of the cure. The butler comes back down and he tells Conan Doyle that Robert Koch will not see him. Why should he? He's just some country doctor. So Koch can't see Conan Doyle can't see Koch. He can't get into the demonstration. He tries to sneak his way in, but the porter catches him, and just as he's pushing him out, an American doctor sees Conan Doyle, hears him arguing his case. Conan Doyle is actually, I should have mentioned, he's carrying an assignment. He has an assignment from the Evening Telegraph of London and the reviews to actually write about this great moment in science. So he has to produce copy. So he's really desperate, and the American doctor hears him, and the American doctor says, I can't let you in, I can't give you my ticket, but meet me afterwards and I'll share my notes with you. And so they do that, and he says, and the American doctor likes him enough to say, okay, actually, tomorrow, I've been invited to tour the wards of Koch's experiment, tour the wards of Koch's hospital, the hospital where the experiment is taking place, and you can join me. So Conan Doyle gets this perfect access, this unexpected and unprecedented access to the wards, and he walks through, and he looks at the charts, and he decides that Robert Koch's cure is nothing of the sort. He recognized, and in fact, the first person to definitively recognize that Koch's remedy is not a remedy. There's a response. It might be good, in fact, as Conan Doyle suggests, it might be good as a diagnostic, but not as a cure. And in fact, he is exactly right. It is still used today to diagnose tuberculosis, but has no curative properties. Now, the important thing here is not just this kind of coincidence, this kind of nice happenstance between two historical figures, but it's important because, in some sense, how they were tied into this greater arc of innovation. Because what Conan Doyle does is on the train ride back to Berlin, or on the train ride from Berlin back to London, well, he goes by way of Calais, I suppose. But on the train ride back, he decides that he is going to give up medicine. He is going to sell his practice, and he is going to devote himself to his writing. And within the next year, he has published the first short stories of that curious detective known as Sherlock Holmes. And it is those short stories, not the novels that came beforehand, but it is those short stories that somehow capture the scientific imagination. The reason this is important is because what Sherlock Holmes was in many ways a channeling of this era, a channeling of what was happening in Koch's labs, in Pasteur's lab, a channeling of this change that was happening, where science wasn't just something, wasn't just the province of Darwin, say, and some kind of intellectual observation, but science was actually starting to have an impact on our daily lives. Is this still coming through? Is this breaking up? I don't know what to do. Bend the mic toward your mouth. I'm bending the microphone. You guys, as I say. And look straight forward. When you look down at your hip, when I look down, okay. I will not move my head from this position. All right. Where was I? Just at the moment of drama? All right. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. All right. So I'll take a breath. So what Conan Doyle was doing was he was capturing the spirit. In fact, he had spent many years before, he had actually observed Conan Doyle, he observed Koch's science and Pasteur's science and written essays, popular essays, celebrating their discoveries. In essence, he was taking what they discovered in the lab and trying to bring it to the public, trying to help the public understand why these discoveries mattered. And he succeeded in that quest most of all in creating Sherlock Holmes. Because Sherlock Holmes, the reason he captured the public imagination at last was because he crystallized this age of science, as nature said. He was an embodiment at the time of the scientific experiment, seen microscopically. So what happens? So Conan Doyle gives up medicine, becomes a famous author. Koch, well, it's another story for Koch. He finds that his cure, which had so thrilled the world, was not quite all that. And he soon leaves for Africa to start some other researches. He basically flees for several years. You're going to have to bear with it. I can bear with it. You can bear with it. But there's something else that happens. This idea, this notion of germs, turns out to start having some sticking power. And I just want to kind of help, again, just as I wanted to impress upon you how profound, how ubiquitous death was, how profound and ubiquitous tuberculosis was at the beginning, think about the change that the germ theory required. Think about the change that was required to get people to believe in germs, to get people to actually, is that all right? There it is. To get people, now. All right. As I say, you guys are the best IT staff I've ever had. Do it again. Okay. Here we go. Oh, come on. It wasn't that bad before. So spitting is my favorite example because spitting was considered healthy. It was considered an expurgation of mellifluous stuff that you needed to get rid of. And so people spat all the time. Spittoons weren't just for people who chewed tobacco. Everybody was spitting all the time. And then all of a sudden comes the germ theory, right? And they had to get people to stop spitting. So they had trucks. Be a good fellow, don't spit on the streets. They had signs. They literally built it into the sidewalks. This is a brick from Cleveland, I believe. This is where, at last, Koch's discovery started to truly have a social impact. This is where it started to spread and started to change people's lives. Because finally, people were convinced that those things called germs existed. And they were convinced that those things called germs could, in fact, change their lives. And if they changed their lives, they might have better lives. So to give you a sense of that change, this is the death rate in New York City from tuberculosis. That purple dot is 1882, when Koch made his discovery. And that, over there, the end of this chart, is 1950, which coincidentally happens to be just the time that antibiotics started to become available, which was, in fact, finally, at last, the cure. That was the cure. That was the chemical cure for tuberculosis. It took that long for something to come along. Penicillin didn't work. Other antibiotics didn't work. It took streptomycin in the late 1940s and finally got widely distributed in the 1950s. But the point of this chart is look at what happened between 1882 and 1950. What was causing that amazing precipitous decline? Less spit. In 2 words. Thank you. I'm done. Koch had his remedy, right? His remedy was the knowledge. The only thing is it took a bit longer for the knowledge to spread than it did if he had actually come up with a chemical curative agent. The actual, why isn't this working? There we go. I did this. This is my little fancy animation. The fact that he had created the insight that germs mattered, it may not have been enough in his lifetime. In fact, he had to sit and watch the first several Nobel Prizes be awarded, in some cases, to his assistants, before finally, in 1905, he would be finally acknowledged for his first original discovery of tuberculosis. Finally, he was given the Nobel in 1905. But it wasn't until 1950 that the true impact of his discovery had come true. He spent the last years of his life trying to prove that tuberculin would, in some sense, cure tuberculosis. And it's unfortunate that he missed the true remedy that he had created. In some sense, missed the power of his true innovation. So this is the notion. And I want to leave you with the idea because I think what we have in this story is the first time when that arc of innovation truly started to change our lives. The germ theory, in some sense, is when science started to help us in our daily lives. And then came computers, and then came agriculture, industrialized agriculture. All those things were wonderful. But if you see this pattern, if you know about this pattern, you start to see it all over the place. You just start to see it manifest in most of the fabric of our lives. And when you can witness it happening, when you can witness it leaping from one stage to another, it's a delightful thing and a gift, I think, to be part of that process and to watch it happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hello? Yes? Could you line up if you're interested in asking questions? Could you come to the center aisle and we'll pass the mic around?
Oh, sorry. You want this? You want to trade? Should we trade?
Am I first?
You're first. Let me have it.
Thanks for being here, Mayor. Is this working? Semmelweis.
Yes.
One of the other anecdotes is of the women who were going to be giving birth, the ones that didn't reach the hospital and gave birth on the sidewalk did better than the women who actually made it to the hospital. And that, in lots of our minds, was the beginning of germ theory. I was very sad to hear of the sad ending of his case. He could have been a Nobel Prize winner, I think. Yeah. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that or not, but that's my statement.
All I have to say is I'm always glad when I'm speaking to smart audiences who know more than I do.
We're talking about society, influencing society. In this day and age, we have certain specialized segments of society that we have to influence. For example, medicine. We know for a fact that recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've discovered that going into an ICU room and putting on a clean gown, not wearing your sport coat, not putting a tie full of bacteria, and we got proof on all this, going in there, scrubbing the arm as if you were going to do surgery, gloving up, putting needles in, reduces complications significantly I mean, we're talking about 180,000 deaths or morbidity a year in the United States alone. This has been published. The persons backing this tried to get U.S. hospitals to do this. Now, we're talking about the year 2010. We're not talking about 1890. They tried to get the hospitals in the United States to do this. The hospitals couldn't get the doctors to do it because they didn't want to be bothered with this sort of thing. They wanted to wear their sport coats. They wanted to wear their ties. They did not want to scrub in and do procedures on patients in the ICU, et cetera. And finally, they took this to Spain. And from what I understand, the Spanish hospitals have adopted this. And there are 3 or 4 hospitals in the United States, the last I read about this, that have adopted this. And their mortality rate and infection rate, et cetera, is like this. And the other ones are continuing to be here. And it's an ongoing process. My point is that getting specialized groups, whether they're congressmen or whether they're doctors or police people, these are the groups that influence the society today. If one of us goes into the ICU and our doctor comes in there and puts on a gown and scrubs our arm with all betadine and has a mask on, we're not going to question that. We're going to assume that's proper medicine. But if he comes in and doesn't have all that on, we're not going to question that either. Yeah. So that's my point is we don't have to affect the whole society with a lot of these things. We have to try and get, and these specialized groups are just as stubborn.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, so hospital-borne infection is a huge problem. Somewhere between 100 and 200,000 Americans die a year of it. And changing the habits of physicians is a big part of that. It's part of our. I mean, in some sense, we need a new germ theory because our understanding of these things as what we call germs, as strictly as pathogens, is, I think, in some sense, coming to an end. The understanding of the microbiome, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, speaks to a much more subtle relationship between the human environment and the microbial environment, and one that, if we in fact try to eradicate germs, we will not only lose, but we will end up doing ourselves a disservice, which is part of what is driving the hospital infection rate or the infection rate in hospitals. So it's a very good point.
So switch it up a little bit. I actually have a question. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm just joking. I was taken by the model of the concentric circles and the path from one circle to another. But I missed that the third to the fourth, which is kind of that final tipping point. And so if we want to learn from the stories you wove here, what was it in that case? What really took us from technology to, industry out to society in the example of germs? Well,
so I guess there are 2 ways of looking at it. And one way of thinking about it would be the germ theory as a discovery didn't actually have, it had an industrial impact in terms of the kind of profusion of disinfectants and all sorts of kind of shifts that changed the way people behaved, or the way people kind of thought about their daily lives. That became commercialized, and that became a kind of shift to the society at large. But if you wanted to think about just tuberculosis, the shift from the industrial or the kind of discovery zone to the kind of society was one that was delayed for many decades, because there was, in some sense, it was the last great disease to have any antidote, or any kind of curative agent. So I think the shift.
Well, but something happened in that graph, though.
Well, don't make too much of my graph. I could have done squares.
Well, but it was headed down. You're right. It didn't go down all the way.
Oh, you mean the New York City deaths?
Right.
So the New York City deaths so I didn't have time to get into it. But the New York City deaths, the champion of the New York City Department of Health in the 1890s was a man named Herman Biggs, who was actually one of the great champions of Robert Koch even after his decline. And Biggs, he actually declared that we have the power to eradicate tuberculosis right now, he said. And he believed that was strictly sanitation and hygiene. And so sanitation and hygiene were actually the things that that started to drive that rate down.
And that was, I mean, that was accessible to the common man. They kind of got
Well, the
that.
problem was, and this is actually where it gets, I mean, it gets more complicated, but one of the actual technique was epidemiology. So it became an issue not just for laboratory science, for public health, which is to say, Biggs' strategy was to go into the warrens, the ghettos of New York City, and to map who got tuberculosis, who had tuberculosis where. And this was incredibly, I'm gonna tell the story because it's this awesome story. It was incredibly controversial. Doctors hated it. They protested against it. They did not want to give the Department of Public Health authority to check on their patients. They didn't want him to make the map. But what was important, and it goes back to kind of some of the basic notions of microbiology, he needed to see the disease. When you can see the disease, whether it under the microscope or on the map, then you have the power to go after it.
Thank you.
So that was a great conversation. I wonder if you could comment on the possibility that the progressive circles of innovation to technology, industry, and society, with the advent of the possibility of wider dissemination and faster dissemination of knowledge, the ideas of patient activation and engagement, that one can actually not need the industry circle, that it begins from the society and then begins to create that own diffusion of information as information becomes widely available and testable.
Right. So I didn't set this up. That's a great idea. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think in some sense there's this other circle that goes beyond society, which is another phase of discovery, which I don't anybody use this because I'm just starting to play with it. But I think it's what I've modestly calling in vitae science, which means science in real life. So not in vitro science or in vivo science, but in vitae, which is to say it's scientific discovery not just by observation, but by participation of the public, and that us sharing our lives, sharing our experiences, sharing what works and what doesn't, that we have a great capacity to create a new level of discovery and insight. So I think there's something to that. Nicely said.
I'm just very interested in the interaction of what's knowledge in the lab and how it gets out of the lab and it's translated. And I think a key thing is the importance or unimportance of the ego. I've been very connected to laboratory work. I'm a scientist. And I find it fascinating how the best scientists will always end the discussion with, let me hear from you. What do you have to offer? And I think you can diminish that point, but you diminish it at a great loss of understanding.
Yeah, I think you're right. Please. To me, one of the great fun parts of writing the book was this ego-driven rivalry between Pasteur and Koch, and thinking about how, I mean, it was really embarrassing for both of them. They wrote these nasty public letters back and forth, and it was ego run amok. And nobody has ego like scientists. But in some sense, that ego was what was driving them to creating these discoveries. So we can enjoy both their insights and the spectacle of their embarrassment.
What you mean to say is for every great thinker, there's a nemesis. A comment and a question. Your story, it's a great story, and what struck me listening to it is the parallel between the modern day story of HIV and AIDS that played itself out locally here, and discovering that HIV was the cause of AIDS is an equally fascinating story that's also the subject of great books, and I couldn't help but thinking about that. The question is this, I think one of the circles that was missing, or is maybe controversial, is the regulatory circle, right? The FDA in the United States didn't exist until 1950 or something like that. 1906. Oh, okay. Well, but they didn't really approve drugs in the classic sense, I think, until the late 40s. But what that presents is the dichotomy of the burden of proof for the society by which the government or the society will make the therapy available versus the spread or the dissemination of therapies or cures that still happens today that don't have to go through that burden of proof. And the great sort of dichotomy is the pharmaceuticals that have to go through the burden of proof to prove that they do something, safety and efficacy, and, for example, vitamins and nutraceuticals, which do not. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
No, are you in the biotech or pharma industry?
Neither. Academia, medicine.
All right.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a very good point. I think it's so two things. One is, as I started the slide with all those snake oil medications, right? So that was what happened in 1906, was that Congress realized that people were dying. They weren't harmless cures; they were deadly cures. And so the creation of the Food and Drug Act in 1906 started the process of regulation that eventually became a very strict approval process. So it's a great dialogue. In a nutshell, my sense on the FDA is they are given an impossible task of, on the one hand, protecting the public health, and on the other, enabling useful medications to reach the public as quickly as possible. And we complain when they don't approve drugs fast enough, and we are outraged and lambast them when there is a medication that people suffer from and causes adverse events. So it is a very difficult position that agency is in. I believe we need regulation in this area. This is one of the things that government is good at, is saving us from chemicals that could otherwise kill us. But it is not an easy job, and I'm not saying that they do the best job of it.
Thomas, great talk. One problem, both you and your excellent introducer unhorsed Sir Arthur. It was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
We don't recognize the nobility here in this country. So.
U.S. law, it's his title, so he's just obeying the law.
Hi, I
really,
really enjoyed your talk, and but I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on a growing movement here in Marin, particularly, of parents who are not vaccinating their children?
I was wondering if this was going to come up. Well, my view is it's not surprising. My view is that vaccination is one of the single most positive discoveries that humanity has ever benefited from, and that we reject that at our peril and at our neighbor's peril and our own children's peril. So I believe very strongly that people should be vaccinated. That isn't to say that there aren't, like anything that it's injected or that we take in, any chemical, there are cases of bad things happen. But those are incredibly rare, and they are not the ones that, such as autism, that have been unscientifically and erroneously associated with vaccination.
I find it really interesting because when I was growing up, I remember the polio epidemic. And a lot of these people, I think, are younger. Maybe they don't remember the horrors of...
That's exactly.
And to turn away these incredible vaccinations that, like Jonas Salk came up with to protect us, I just don't understand it. And then it puts all of us at risk.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about it because it's a whole other thing. But it's the paradox of protection. So because we no longer experience infectious disease the way they did in 1860, because it is not ubiquitous, because in some sense we do not know what we get colds, we might get the flu. Occasionally, we might know somebody who has a strep infection or a particularly grave infectious disease. But by and large, one of the bounties of our civilization at this point in time is that infectious disease does not exist for most of us in our day-to-day lives. That protection makes us, in some sense, ignorant of what the other side would look like.
I know. Pertussis is really on the rise in Marin, so thank you.
Thank you for your talk and all your humorous interjections about us being an IT crowd. I was proud of our collective innovative insight into the handheld microphone. So my question's about the New York slide, about the tuberculosis death rates, and I was just curious, the decline looked like from 1804 to 1840s, that it was like 40 or 50% drop until Koch's discovery. I wondered if you knew why that decline had occurred.
So it went up and down. Let me just give you the dot again. Yeah. So it went up and down. There were, so tuberculosis was really an urban disease. It existed millennia ago. They find tuberculosis in Egyptian mummies, but it was really the advent of industrial age and heavy urbanization, where people were living in tight, close proximity, and coughing on each other and spitting on each other, and that was what really drove the disease. But largely, this is the New York City slide. If you look at international or national rates, it's almost uncanny how 1882 was this kind of cliff year. So yes, there are peaks and valleys, but it's if you normalize the curve, it's a pretty profound trajectory down. And I should say, there was such a thing as the sanitation movement and the hygiene movement in the decades before Koch. Florence Nightingale was a believer in sanitation. Oddly, she was a profound denier of germs. So people were advancing the sanitation movement, even despite a knowledge of or a belief in such a thing as germs. So it gets complicated, but it's a good question. All right, maybe last question.
My question is actually about Conan Doyle, which may not be totally where you are, but he was not exactly a skeptic in his life. He believed in fairies, he believed in spirits, and that you could speak with spirits from the other side. I believe he was the big supporter of the Piltdown Man or the Cardiff Giant and all these pseudoscientific, lunatic fringe stuff. What made him correct with Koch? He believed in every kind of lunacy.
Yeah, that's a great. So the last decades of his life, Conan Doyle. What happened? In fact, sorry, for those of you who stayed, here's what I should have said before. So in 1883, Conan Doyle's wife is diagnosed with tuberculosis. And see, it's like you wait for the end of the credits and then there's this little thing at the end. So in 1883, his wife is diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he spends the next decade trying to find a cure. They go to Davos, Switzerland, which was started as a sanitarium. They go to the desert. They go around the world looking for a cure. They find none. They don't ever try Koch's tuberculin, and she dies of the disease. In I believe 1903, somewhere around there. His next wife is in some sense one that he started to really get involved in spiritualism, and believes in fairies and all of those other pseudoscientific things. But in the early years of his life, and up until really that point, Conan Doyle was a fierce advocate of science. He would write letters to the editor in praise of vaccination. He would conduct public debates in praise of science. It was really this profound shift, and the English public was, in some sense, horrified that this paragon of science, and he kept writing the Sherlock Holmes stories off and on. They loved his stories, but they grew more and more uncomfortable with who he was in his private life. All right. Thank you all.